Secure the beach. Prepare to invade the street.
I struck without honor.
This entire war is without honor.
And she murdered my son, stole my kingdom. She will not cost me my beloved.
We spilled blood so that the Horde will endure.
Burn it!
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third episode of the Azeroth Book Club. Here I am just jumping straight into things, no warm-up required. And already I've forgotten what I was going to say. So that's a brilliant start. We're only, 15 seconds in. That's why I do that warm-up, because then I remember what I'm going to say. But anyways, we are covering... we're not going on to Night Elves like we promised in the last episode. We are taking a little bit of a scenic detour through Teldrassil by covering the recent Collector's Edition novellas and Elegy and a Good War, written by Christy Golden and Robert Brooks. Am I making that name up? I hope I'm not. No, I got it right. I'm not embarrassed at all. So yeah, joining me as always, we've got Katie and Nick from the Tauren and the Goblin. Guys, how are you doing?
I mean, I'm doing great. Anytime we get to talk about lore is like my favorite day, so I'm like, yes, we finally get to talk about these books. I've read them a couple of times both, and the novel, the actual physical novel they included in the collector's edition is just beautiful. So if you haven't had a chance to go look at it or look at some of the pictures, I know people have posted pictures of it. Go ahead and do that because it's a treat. I absolutely love it. It doesn't replace the art book, however, I love it in addition. So still hoping for an art book at some point.
I think there will be soon. Nick, sorry.
I don't know that there will be. They've been doing some kind of art station thing on Twitter where they've been putting a lot of what looks like the concept art that you'd see in the art book, and I think that's how they're presenting that information. So, not to dash your hopes, but I'm doing very well because I like dashing people's hopes. So.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it.
Dreams officially dashed, which is great. I've just been doing a video actually on the Collector's Edition, and part of it is me talking about why I hope we get an art book, but... yeah, you're right. I think in some ways they're doing something different. But anyways, we're not talking about the art, but we're talking about its much better replacement, I say, with a little bit of irony, because I know how people have sort of kicked the Collector's Edition because it doesn't have an art book. But this book, Elegy and a Good War, I personally really enjoyed it. Really great stuff. By the way, these things are available in PDF form, so if you're sitting there going, oh God, where do I get this thing? The internet, first and foremost. I guess eBay. It's your second choice, and heck, fork up the 90 quid or 100 or something dollars for the collector's edition if you're interested. But over to you guys. I'll start with you, Nick. Nick, general thoughts on the novellas? What did you think?
They were really good. I think they were crucial for understanding everything that happened in the War of the Thorns. And I know a lot, I mean, I think we talked about this at the time on both of our podcasts, that a lot of the player emotions that were evoked as far as what happened with Sylvanas and whatnot, I think they would have been alleviated knowing the full story that wasn't completely in game. But I mean, even putting that aside as far as whether you felt this should have been told in game or outside of the story, it's a great story, very well written. I mean, Christy Golden, some of the notes that she hits, there's some gut punches in there. And she, I mean, I need to start wearing like chest protector when I read her stuff because I'm getting punched in the chest all the time. So Robert Brooks does a great job with he does the Horde stuff, I think, right? So I mean, Robert Brooks does great stuff with the Horde side as well. There's a lot of neat little things that you get that we'll talk to, and overall I just liked them a lot.
Brilliant. Casey, your thoughts?
I love them. Again, like it kind of was Nick was saying, it's tough to say whether or not they should have been in game, but it gives so much more once you've actually read it. It's like you play the in-game content, you're like, oh, this is cool, this is good, but it really feels like you're missing something if you don't read this, because it gives you all insight into all of the characters, even some of what they're feeling. It explains so much of like motivations, things that were kind of left out of the in-game content, and I was very I would say, I was in that group of people that was passionately upset about things, and then I read it and I was like, oh, I'm good, I'll just sit back now, like, this is okay, everything's good now, it's okay, I'll just sit down. We'll get into that more. So it's definitely worth a read if people haven't. It's absolutely wonderful. Both Christine Golden and Robert Brooks have done an amazing job fleshing out these characters, and it was a treat. It was a joy. Like, in addition to Before the Storm, I was like, yes, more written content. So excited with content. So anyway.
No, that's brilliant. I for the listeners listening, I think they're getting a sense that there's going to be a lot of positive stuff here. I guess we could probably save some room for a little bit of critique. I guess
yes.
I'm sure I can squeeze some in somewhere, and there's some things I've got to say. But generally, a really good book. But obviously, this is. I'm going to use a very big cliche. This is obviously a book of two halves. So, and Nick, you were talking about just before the show about the order in which we read them and how that plays a point. So I wonder if the ball's over into everyone's court now. How should we play this? Should we talk about the order we read them in, rather? Or do you want to go straight into a particular book, and I'll let you guys decide?
I think we should go straight into a particular book, cool. And then when it's important to note like how you reacted to a scene because you had read the context in a certain order, then we can bring that up.
Okay.
Cool. And which book is that? I feel like we could chuck one of those collector's coins like you did on your recent podcast, but I live in a flat and there are people living below me, and I don't want to sort of have a coin go through their ceiling or anything like that.
I do not have my coin readily available. I wish I'd known that. I totally would have done that.
I have mine readily available, but yeah, I don't want to chuck it. But I tell you what, let's start with Horde. I'll make a decision because I think. I don't know, because now I read it the other way. I read Elegy and A Good War after that. You guys read A Good War and then Elegy. What do you want to start?
I mean, the other thing we can do is just kind of start going through events in general.
That's true.
And then just kind of start talking about where they diverge.
That's a good point.
Because, I mean, I think that really, just the fact the way that they split it as they did is a fascinating decision.
Yes.
Because... I mean, there's been plenty of times, like, you've read a book, and it's usually not the entire book is told in this fashion, but, like, there's plenty of times where you're reading a book and it's kind of jumping back and forth between different character viewpoints, and you'll get to a certain sequence where, like, two characters will interact, and during the sequence, they'll jump back and forth between the two characters, and especially when the characters, like, don't know each other, and it goes from being like, like, Jim did this, and then, Brian did this, as opposed to, Jim did this, and then the unknown assailant guy did this, and then it goes to Ryan's perspective, and he's like, oh, well, Ryan did this, and he knows who Jim is, so he's like, well, Jim did, like, and we get that a few times, like, why can't I think of the Blood Elf's name? There's the blonde Blood Elf that we worked with. And like when he encounters Malfurion and like he knows who Malfurion is. So he's like, yeah, I'm ready to take this guy on. And then Malfurion's just like this weird blonde, Blood Elf showed up and I just face stomped him.
Yeah.
Like it's
poor guy.
It's one of those things like they very easily could have just
been a footnote.
Could have just
like you didn't have to
told the story in that fashion. And the fact that they didn't, I think is fascinating.
Yes. Well, I think it's really neat that they give us so many unique characters, like characters that we'll never either probably encounter. I think if I remember, his name is Chicker, like the goblin, right? And it's like, oh, well,
yes.
One of the characters is like, well, why is her name that? And he's like, my friends gave me that horrible name. Like, I don't want to talk about it. Like, so we get to see these little footnote characters. I would call them footnotes, but they have so much spark in them, which was really fun. Again, it kind of feels like, I want to say it's Christine Golden's calling card a little bit, but also I don't know Robert Brooks that well. So it's one of those things where it's like, oh, here's these like really fun, interesting characters that we're just going to slip in here and you're never going to hear from them again. And again, as you said, Nick, it's like, oh, I need to wear armor because it's like, oh, and then they died horribly. I'm like, no, these characters that you've made me care about, how dare you?
I'm disappointed that I didn't put money down that Mr. Chickers was going to be the first character you mentioned out of the books.
I mean, it's a goblin with a giant crab pet.
It was either going to be him or the goblin SI7 spy. Yes. It was one of the two of them that you were going to bring up first.
I'm the goblin in the Tor and the Goblin. I have to call out to my dudes. So, but yeah, no, I actually, I knew that goblin from my days in Stormwind, and I was like, you're still around, and I'm also mad at you for being a spy, but you're a goblin, so we're okay. That's the only reason you're not dead. I saw him in the... Sorry, I'm like taking...
No, go for it.
When I was playing the beta, I saw him in the Siege of Orgrimmar, or not Siege of Orgrimmar, sorry, the Siege of Lordaeron, and I was like, I see you. I know who you are. I tried to remember his name, but I was like, I know you're a double agent. You're a jerk for being a double agent, because I'm a goblin and I'm mad about it, but I guess it'll be fine, so I won't kill you. Only because you're a goblin. That's the only thing that saves you. So, we'll just move right along past my upsettedness.
We had to cover goblins at some point with you guys on the show, and well, I don't know. We do get some Tauren representation, so I guess we can touch on that a bit later.
It's minimal.
It's minimal.
It's not really a Tauren book.
No, but
that's fine.
It was fun that we had a lot of different races thrown in there that I never expected to see. So I get perhaps
Definitely.
just jump right in. So
yeah, and let's go for it. And I think just touching on what you guys have said, I think that the thing I really love, and bringing up exactly what you said, Nick, was the fact that it shows the mechanisms of perspective in conflict. The fact that you come across whichever book you read, you will come across characters who will do things, and that you don't understand the motivations. So you see the enemy actions, but without the motivations behind them, and then you start to see it when you go and revisit from the other side. And that might seem something really simple, but for me, it kind of struck home. You sat there and think, well, actually, you don't realise that there are good motivations for why people do what seem to you like very bad things, and therefore it's a good lesson in that alone. And I do hope they do more stuff like this, because if Battle for Azeroth is anything, it's a conflict of perspective, especially when you think about some of the leaders playing out. But totally, let's jump in. So both books open up with the sort of fallout of the Burning Legion's attack on Azeroth. So we have, from the Alliance perspective, I guess as near to peace as the Alliance has probably had for a while. So we have Anduin and Greymane having a training session. Anduin is trying to continue to rise up to the role as king. He is continuing to keep tabs on the Horde. Obviously, we have the connotations going on from the cinematic, where Anduin knows what Sylvanas is doing, so there's a certain level of distrust. They are planning around that. And that's contrasted by what's happening on the Horde, which is basically all the guards are not doing their job, and they're all getting drunk. Especially the Tauren there. I got a Tauren reference.
That's right, that's right, yes.
So,
yes.
But on a serious note, the Horde is having a moment of quiet. I guess it is peace to an extent, but they're not... Unlike the Alliance, they seem to be more... well, I don't know. I was going to say they seem more... they've succumbed to the idea that I think the next conflict's on the horizon, whereas the Alliance is possibly not quite there yet. But anyways, what did you guys think about that sort of opening prelude, the politics that we opened up to? Katie, you're looking very wise at the moment.
Well, I was expecting Nick to jump into something, and I saved my bacon while I was thinking. So, I don't know, Nick, if you want to start.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think technically the Horde story starts slightly before the Alliance one. That the Alliance, they're already getting the reports of, hey, there's strife between Sylvanas and Nathanos and Sorfang, and we know from the Horde side that that's all manufactured.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so right off the bat, depending on which one you chose to start with, you're already seeing how some of these games are going to play out here. And I think it's interesting because, once again, like, I think because what we talked about Before the Storm, and when you were reading Before the Storm, especially because we didn't quite know, like, the burning of Teldrassil hangs over all of this, and we didn't quite know until like a good way through Before the Storm, like, oh, they're not going to get to the burning of Teldrassil in this. And here we know, like, this is directly what it's leading to. This is the story of the burning of Teldrassil, and so we kind of get that. Like, I think one of the things with Before the Storm was that we kept waiting for that axe to fall. That it's like, okay, like, here we go. Like, and it falls, but in a different way than you expect. And here it's like, okay, we're going to start with that piece. And then the axe kind of falls pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. That they sort of ramp, this is very much like, okay, we're going to start in some simple peacetime. We're going to see some of the games that Sorfang is going to play. And then all of a sudden it's like, boom, let's go. And let's, and they put the plan into motion, and then we just hit the ground running. And it helps that the way they broke it up into the little chapters. So, mm-hmm. Like the first chapter is very much, they're moving some pieces around on the chessboard. The Horde is literally moving pieces around on the chessboard, like getting themselves ready to do their attack. And then I think like chapter 2, it's like, okay, it's go time, and everything really just picks up from there. So it's, mm-hmm. The opening, it's a bit slow, but it's intentionally a bit slow. And to even call it slow, it's not that slow, because this is all, it just immediately starts going. You're moving towards something big.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, totally. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Katie, go on, yeah.
No, it's just a lot of what Nick said. I really enjoyed, at least for me, reading the Horde one first. I mean, a little bit of a faction bias there, perhaps, but it was cool because technically it starts there first, and that was really fun to read that side and then go back to the Alliance side and like which side, like both sides think that they're on top of things, and you realize both sides in a lot of cases aren't as on top of things as they think they are, and so that was kind of fun watching and balancing between both of those. But I was just gonna throw that in there because I love just the little bit where Sourfang goes and chews out some of the guards for being drunk, like you guys were saying. It was a good start. It was a humorous start. So.
And there's that carry on from the old Soldier cinematic. I say carry on, that sort of intertwine this with the cinematic, because the Horde side opens up with Sourfang's dream of cremating his son back on Draenor. So he carries, I don't know how, that seems like it should be a story in itself. He takes the body of his son from Northrend back to not Draenor, but somewhere
Outland,
in the ground, I think.
Yeah.
Outland, yeah. And he has that he has that dream when he wakes up, and as you say, he sort of does the old gruff soldier thing. You've got these soldiers who have gone through absolute hell, and he acknowledges that. He realizes they've gone through an absolutely horrible time through the Broken Shore conflict and with the Burning Legion, but he can't bring himself to quite let them off the hook yet, even though he knows there's no conflict, that this is as close to peace as they have. He still expects them to do their jobs, and that includes not getting drunk. Although, interestingly, I think one of the, and hopefully I can say this in the right way, I think you get the first interesting connotation of sort of inter-race relations with the Horde. Like, doesn't one of the Orcs or one of the Taurens start trying to chat up one of the others or something like that? And that's something I've never seen in Warcraft lore. I'm not trying to get into that as a particular topic, but I it kind of struck me. I was like, what happens there? Like, hey, but
you don't spend enough time in Goldshire?
Well, yes, but but in fairness, the Alliance is made up of relatively humanoid characters. I think I don't know. I'm not making a comment. It just struck me as something a bit odd. But the real focus. Go on.
I think what you're saying is that in like 10 years, we're going to have some really ugly-looking allied races.
I think we're going to have some very confused allied races, definitely, yeah.
I'm just going to shake my head at both of you here.
I know. And,
one thing...
Sorry, I was going to say, going back to Before the Storm, obviously we had, the Goblin and Gnome romance, so, who am I to pass
anything
judgment?
can happen. Hey, you know what? Like, half-orc human things before they were retconned was totally a thing, so... Mm-hmm. I was going to say Garona and Medan.
Rexar.
Just because they were retconned, it doesn't mean that they can't happen again.
True.
It's not the...
Anyways, my weird biology lesson has taken us off course.
How dare you?
Yeah, this took a turn.
Yeah,
this took a turn.
Listeners, Novella is the story of a horrible biology project set up by Sylvanas to interbreed Horde warriors. But no. Sorry, Nick, you were going to say.
No, I just want to say something. It's interesting that you brought up that it starts with Saurfang's dream about the death of his child, because Old Soldier starts with Saurfang in the snow with Draenosh, when he died, or I just died the second time. And I wonder, why is Blizzard hammering, I know that Saurfang's important, and obviously, his role going forward, we have yet to see what that is, but it's interesting that they're hammering home not just Saurfang, not just his role to the Horde, but Saurfang having lost his kid in very specific ways at the start of all this. That they did it in Old Soldier, they did it here, and what does that portend for him going forward? I'm asking that rhetorically. I don't want to turn this into a big discussion of Saurfang. but I just find it fascinating that that twice now, that's how it starts for Saurfang. It's not anything else. It's not him, with the screaming Draenei back during, when they took over Shatrath and all that back in the past. It's nothing from the other wars. It's specifically him sort of dealing with the trauma of losing his kid. And maybe that's where the center of his character is at this point.
It's kind of interesting. Well, because I think there's an interesting, it's not quite a parallel, but you can draw it to him and Anduin in a way, because Anduin's just lost his father. And so I think, in a good, or not a good war, but in the Old Soldier, you have everyone's favorite Zappy boy, Zakan, who is like, oh, well, I lost my father as well. And so they have that bonding moment there. But it is interesting that they keep bringing up his child, and both in A Good War and the cinematic, because you're like, okay, like, because I feel like a lot of people may or may not remember it because it was from ICC, but I'm like, with all the Death Knight stuff on the horizon, Bolvar's probably not doing great. That's some speculation I have on the horizon. I'm like, yeah, I think we're going to have some trouble there. So that might be something to think about as well.
I think you're onto something there, because the whole point of this book is about mirroring, and you're 100% right. There are characters that mirror each other. So you have, on each side, characters who have lost a son. You have Gen and you have Saurfang. You have characters who have lost a father, and Zakan is kind of a loose one, because Zakan doesn't appear in this, but you have Anduin. You're 100% right. And they do build this sense of mirroring, because I think the problem is they're trying to tell I say problem, it's not a problem, but they're trying to tell a unified story through two very distinct factions, and therefore you see a lot of similar stories building up. But I think that will lead, Saurfang will come again, because probably one of my critiques is how Saurfang gets portrayed in this, and I realise I'm looking at two Horde players trying to say I'm going to come back to Saurfang and probably kick him down at a peg or two, but we'll come back to that.
He can take it.
He can take it.
He will. He'll probably knock me stone cold. I definitely don't want to mess with him. But we have this really nice setup for the politics behind it. One thing I wanted to get out of you was the deception at the heart of this conflict. Yes. So Sylvanas, and what surprised me coming through this, and this is part of my criticism, Saurfang have agreed deliberately to present this idea of sending not only sending an army to Silithus, but this sort of deep political feud between the pair of them, when in fact they are actually on the same page. And the reason they present this is because they know that Orgrimmar is full of spies. Anduin at the start of Elegy says, I want so many spies in Orgrimmar that when Sylvanas has a beer, I want to know what colour the ale is, which I think is a really cool line. And they do pack Orgrimmar with so many spies that they seem to be finding like 3 or 4 a day, I think. And that's one of the things that comes up, I think, in the first chapter of A Good War, is that Saurfang either comes across a spy or that one of the soldiers comes across a spy. And that sets up things that moves the story along a little bit. But I just wondered what you thought about that deception, because to me that seemed odd for Saurfang, given his view of honor. A lot throughout the whole of A Good War, he talks about honorable conflict and being able to face the enemy head on. And yet at the heart of this is actually a really sneaky deception that is very Sylvanas style. So what did you guys think of that?
It's one of those things where I think honorable combat, I think, applies to sort of the hand-to-hand style, like when you're actually facing each other on the battlefield. But setting up that battlefield beforehand, that's all military tactics. And I guess technically, I mean, Sylvanas has been presented as one of the best tacticians on the planet, and so I guess Saurfang would be a little bit below her in that regard. But I think that as far as manipulating the enemy to get them to do what you want, that the personal honor doesn't necessarily apply to that. One of the questions that I've had going into this, and really the question applies more to Sylvanas, we can get to this later, but trying to apply the old D&D alignment rubric to each of the characters, and like Saurfang, I feel like he wants to be lawful good from his perspective, and I don't think he quite is, though. No. It's one of those things, like, do you apply the rubric based on how he wants to be, or how he sees himself, or how he actually is? And I feel like this is a very good thing to bring up as a point, because it's like, well, I think this kind of moves him to maybe like chaotic, like, I'm not sure if it moves him like across to chaotic good or down to like lawful neutral, but I don't think he quite, like, I think you're right, like, this doesn't completely square with the view of honor that he should have, and I don't think he's aware that it, like, he's not aware of the conflict for himself. I think if you sat down and pointed it out to him, he'd probably get upset and then like go away and then think about it later.
And probably punch me in the head, I'd imagine, just before he left.
Just for letting him know.
Yeah. Sorry, Casey, you were saying?
Oh, no, it's interesting that you guys bring that up, because it's not something that I thought about a lot, like, because I think of him as he's an old soldier, as the video is appropriately titled. Like, I think in my mind he's gone through so many things that he's like, whatever it takes to be tactical is what we have to do because it will save the most lives. Like, and he seems in the book, it was really interesting for me to read it because he seems like he's having fun at this deception game. I'm like, maybe he hasn't done a lot of deception before, but he's like, yeah, like this is kind of fun. Like, I'm gonna go fight Nathanos, and it's gonna be great. I'm gonna rough him up a bit. And I was like, hold on there, Sourfang. Like, this is kind of new for you to like be all sneaky. But he seemed to, as you guys had kind of said, it seems like he's enjoying this kind of out of character moment for him. And I don't know if that's just because he's used to being very head-on, which most orcs tend to be. But it was really fun to see his character in a different light instead of just like, I'm the honorable orc and I'm going to punch things with my face. And I'm like, how do you punch things with your face? He's like, I'm an orc. I'm like, okay, that's fair. So it was interesting that you guys also picked up on how it didn't quite seem characteristic, but we haven't heard a lot of orc perspectives in a while. Like, no. I think Thrall was the last really big orc perspective we've had for a while, besides Draenor, but that wasn't the best episode.
I mean...
He's also punching things with his face. He's not very tactical. Just... It's an orc.
This isn't... I would argue possibly Garrosh wouldn't have done things too differently than how things played out in this book.
That's true, which is also kind of interesting in itself, isn't it?
Although,
I don't know. I think he might have foregone the manipulation ahead. Well, I don't know, because he... I mean, even then, if you look at how he handled like the Siege of Theramore, like he didn't... I mean, as direct as it was, it's not like he just marched directly on it. He still played some games. So yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things. I feel like the characters are as smart as Blizzard wants them to be.
Yeah. Hindsight's a wonderful thing.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, I'll move things along a little bit. So those first chapters, and we haven't talked really much more about the Alliance side, but I think the Alliance, as you say, Nick, the Alliance side plays off a little bit later than what we see, and in a sense plays off in response to what we see. So Anduin is, taking the challenge as king. He is getting information about some of the rifts that are happening between Saurfang and Sylvanas, and what ultimately concludes in that first chapter is him commanding Tyrande through his role as king to send the troops south to Silithus, which obviously sets the whole thing in motion perfectly for chapter 2. So we'll jump straight in there, because I think that's where the meat of this starts to really turn up. Now, something that straws at the back of my mind is that scene where Bane, I hope I'm not getting this wrong. Is it Bane? Not Cairn Bloodhoof? Which one's wrong?
Yeah, it's Bane.
It's Bane, yeah. Oh,
Karen is the father. You're good.
Yeah.
You got
it. So many cats to keep track of. I'm going back about 10 years. When Bane is sort of onto the plan, so to speak. So Saurfang is mobilizing the troops. Bane knows what's happening, and they meet at the gates of Ogaran. He's like, I hope this is for a good cause and that you do the right thing and that sort of thing. And I think that was really interesting, because it obviously links back to the Fall of Lordaeron cinematic, which is this huge level of mistrust and the politics of the Horde. Again, I know we're talking about the politics of the Horde, and we'll talk about the Alliance in a minute, but I thought that was an interesting scene. You say that the Tauren aren't a big part, but I think Bane's role is actually quite significant, because it shows that, heck, you know what? The Horde might not be 100% on board with what Saurfang did, let alone what Sylvanas is doing. And that's where the real rifts potentially can happen.
I think it's one of those situations where Bane, more than anyone, in a lot of ways, is presented as sort of the heart of the Horde. Mm-hmm. I mean, we know from the last Horde rebellion which side he stood on. We see Bane again left to sort of, I think, represent sort of the honorable player, as it were. And, there's plenty of people who have, are fine with whatever issues that, that as far as whatever Sylvanas does, there's plenty of people that are fine with that and they'll follow her to the ends of the earth. But Bane is there. And I think more so than Saurfang, because Saurfang clearly has his own agenda, his own plot, his own arc that he's going on. Because, none of the Alliance players are sitting or none of the Horde players are sitting in Alliance prison right now. So, I think Bane is more to represent our perspective, because he's not taking direct action. He's just kind of like we can't take direct action because we're forced by whatever, Blizzard tells us to do. Mm-hmm. But Bane, and I think they're kind of letting Bane not take direct action either, because this way it puts him in the same boat as us, that he's just a passive observer. Even though he has agency within the story that he could use, he's not. I think he's there more as the vessel for the player to be like, okay, like we know you know what's going on because we told you what's going on. So here's kind of your chance to smile Riley at Sorfang and be like, okay, I hope you got this, because whatever's going to happen is kind of it's kind of on everybody's head, but Sorfang especially being such a pivotal part of that. That lets, I think it gives a bit of a release to the player in that regard, or the reader, I guess, in this case.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to take like one half step back and say that I thought it was interesting Sylvanas was able to convince Starfang, which it didn't take a ton of convincing, but we should go to war again because there's no such thing as peace. And he was like, oh, I don't know. Like at first he was like, no, but I think there should be peace. And she's like, yeah, but really, how long would it last? He's like, you're not wrong. And I'm like, and this is why we have problems. This is why we can't have nice things as Horde players. We always gotta fight somebody. But
I did love the gymnastics that they did, and it wasn't necessarily flawed gymnastics.
No, it wasn't.
But because when we start before the storm, Sylvanas is like, let's take Stormwind, and then we go on this whole journey, and by the end of the book, you've forgotten like this was all about taking Stormwind at first, and now here again we get that question like, okay, well, how do we get from Stormwind to Teldrassil? And then like she just goes like step by step through this plan. Like they could have had like a PowerPoint presentation.
I know,
to like just sit there like with a little like just point through like, okay, so if we're gonna take Stormwind, we have to like take Teldrassil.
We have to break their hearts.
The only thing that's left, the only thing missing is like we have to burn Teldrassil. That's the only thing that we don't get to. That comes later, but it was very well done by I guess the entire WoW team. I'm not going to credit just the author for that, because whoever came up with that logic was just brilliant.
Well, I just want to take a second to be like, I was doing mental somersaults prior to reading this. Like, okay, so why would we take Teldrassil? Because it doesn't seem tactical. If we want Stormwind, like, why are we burning a tree in the middle of the ocean? Like, that seems dumb. And then after actually going through this book, after listening to Sylvanas' side, I actually, like, this was one of those where I'm like, okay, Sylvanas seems a little cray. I'm like, oh, wow, Sylvanas is really on top of this. Like, as a Horde player, it redeemed a lot of faith, but I'm like, also, man, I would not want to make her upset. Like, nope, like, Sylvanas is great. Please don't kill me. Like, you're afraid of Sourfang coming and knocking some sense into you, but like, no, Sylvanas is the one you need to worry about. She's the scary one. So, but anyway,
I don't want to say she's not crazy, but she's crazy in a very logical way.
Yeah, she's like
which is like you're saying is actually worse.
Yeah, it is worse. It's like the most scary kind of crazy. It's like, I'm incredibly intelligent and I'm going to wreck your entire world crazy, and you're like, ooh. You're like, I'm glad I'm on your side, but I'm also like, it's like the nervous thing. Like, I'm kind of nervous that I'm on your side, but I'm glad I'm not against you. And then you just watch the tree burning in the background. You're like, this is not fine, but here we are. So anyway,
and that's definitely something I want to come back to, because I think the plan Sylvanas has for, as you say, Nick, okay, the role Teldrassil plays in breaking the alliance, and it's a very clever plan. She she goes to the detail of thinking, well, if we capture Teldrassil and hold their people hostage, the Night Elves will absolutely demand that the Alliance go to war over it, and Anduin won't let them, because I think if I'm right, she argues that Gen will demand that they save Gulganeus first before they, or rather he'd question why they didn't save Gulganeus, but they're going to go and save Teldrassil, and that friction is what will break down the Alliance. Ironically, she invites that same friction herself by committing to the plan, but I think that's a really good thing to bring up later, because it's Anduin's struggle with a similar level of decisiveness that I think causes him to have that problem later on. But sort of leading toward, so in the second chapter of the Horde side, we get the march towards Silithus. We get the as you say, Bane's role, and I agree, as our sort of passive reader. You know, I know what you're up to, and it's not good, but you know, for the Horde, all that stuff. But on the Alliance side, we get an interesting perspective. So we get introduced to Delarid Sunmoon, who will play a larger role. Obviously, later it plays a very large role on the Alliance side. And the Sentinels, we get introduced to the Druid as well, Ferrin, who doesn't have a surname, and a couple of other sort of minor characters. And I think one of the things that strikes me about that particular chapter is the almost how unexpected Ashenvale is for conflict in some ways. I don't know if you guys sort of that hit you at all, that Ashenvale was the front line of what the Alliance is expecting to be a frontline conflict, and yet I don't know why and maybe I'm stumbling a bit here, but what struck me was, if you were Anduin or you were any of the Alliance leaders, why wouldn't you see Ashenvale as something you had to build up as a massive potential front line in a conflict? I don't know, that maybe that's me in hindsight, but I don't know if you guys agree on that one.
Well, I think it goes back to the question of, like, why do they keep rushing into, like, where Sylvanas has, like, set up her forces without expecting the Blight, that they don't... I think, and I think maybe that part of this is just sort of, I don't know if it's sort of like the naivety of good, that you don't think that, oh, like they would do this, or specifically Anduin's naivety as far as what Sylvanas is capable of. But yeah, I think I think you don't think it's as an active a front as you think, that you have time to build it up. It's, you know, if you're playing a game of Risk and you're too worried about Kamchatka and then they come through like Australia or whatever, it's true. It's terrible.
I actually find it interesting that the Night Elves haven't, because if we think about Cataclysm and when Garrosh basically stormed all of Ashenvale, he did a pretty thorough job of making it a large mess. I started as a Night Elf player ages ago, 10 years ago, and I'm like, I loved Ashenvale, and it broke my heart in Cataclysm when Garrosh stormed through there and they upended the entire zone. But it's one of those things where it's like, one of the things the Horde always needs is lumber, right? So we see that in Stone Talon, we see that a lot in Ashenvale, and that's why Garrosh went through there in the first place. So this is one of those things where I'm like, I would imagine this is still a big point of contention between the Horde and the Alliance, because it's like, oh, well, we need lumber in Orgrimmar. Let me just stroll on over to Ashenvale and start chopping down some trees. I'm sure the Night Elves will be fine with that. And that's a zone, in a lot of ways, that we don't know what's happened to it since the Cataclysm. We don't know if there's still a lot of Horde forces there. It sounds like maybe not. And so, I mean, again, Cataclysm is how many years old now? So we don't know what the narrative has been. But I was still surprised that they didn't either have new towers, they didn't have people watching Orgrimmar from there, because it's so close. It's like a stone's throw. Well, at least in the game, it's a stone's throw. So I was very surprised when they were just like, oh, and we're just going to turn our army at the Barrens to just march right through, and that's going to be fine, and no one's going to know or see, or it's going to be a big surprise. And I don't know. It felt strange from the Night Elf perspective that they didn't have anyone really guarding it, but also, you know, maybe if they don't do that, I don't know.
Well, they did have people guarding it, but they were taken down by the rogues. But it was
true.
Exactly, and I guess that's the question. Is like they had people, but just not enough.
Right.
And it was enough that at this point the Alliance knew exactly who they were dealing with to be able to just take them out as quickly as they could.
The Horde. Who they were.
The Horde, yes, the Horde.
No, that is a good point. I guess what that chapter does, though, is it heightens that sense that even Ashenvale, this potential front line, is in a sort of state of peace. They're not really expecting much. I think is it Chandris or whoever's leading them out there, that sort of rugged veteran. You know, she runs them through the paces, but ultimately it's not for anything in particular. It's just because she's ironically, I think, the perfect contrast to Saurfang, in that she herself is I think it's Chandris. Am I getting that wrong? Is she the?
I thought Chandris Feathermoon was the one of the generals. Not. I could be wrong. I thought.
True. I am.
So I'm pretty sure Feathermoon is Chandris Feathermoon is like Tyranda's almost child. She's not actually a child of her, but she, in the books we're about to read, they actually give her all of her interesting backstory. So she's like this pseudo-adoptive child of Tyranda Whisperwind.
I've got this is a Naris Windward. There's too many S's.
Oh, okay, yes.
But she's kind of this rugged veteran who doesn't. You know, she's been through conflict. She's been posted to Ashenvale. Even Delarin can't understand why she hasn't been sent off to, you know, fight on the other potential front lines. But she does her duty, which I think is kind of where Saurfang could have easily ended up. But you get this image of Ashenvale, which is peaceful, and then it all falls apart very, very quickly, in a very coordinated manner. And handing over to you guys, the portrayal of how the assassins strike from the Horde perspective. What did you guys think of that?
Well,
Yep.
I'll just. I thought I really enjoyed both kind of perspectives, because as a Horde player, you actually do get to play a little of this, or you did, when it was live content, right? They had your character. You actually get to interact, I think, with one of or two of the characters that are actually in the book, and you're like, okay, like, you know, the rogue's like, all right, let's go murder some elves. I'm like, that doesn't feel like a good thing to do. Like, let's please not murder elves. He's like, oh yeah, but we're gonna murder elves. I'm like, I don't really want to do that. But, so we do. But that's what's interesting is, like, you get, at least your character gets kind of firsthand experience for this in the Horde side. So it was interesting to also see it reinforced in the novels, like talking about how they're going to do coordinated strikes, how they're going to take out people, taking out that very, enthusiastic elven leader, if we will say so. And it kind of, it's equal parts really good storytelling and really tragic that, you know, she was working her troops so hard for nothing that it actually wound up being one of their greatest downfalls, that they were tired and that they couldn't respond quickly enough because she was trying to keep them on their toes but was overextending it. So I don't know. Go ahead, Nick. You look like you have something to say.
Well, I think again it just plays into the whole how unexpected it was.
Yes.
That if it's one of those things that I think you're gonna work them extra hard because, like, oh, you know, like, you're here kind of in a place where we're not expecting conflict, without realizing that, like, yeah, if that conflict does come that you don't expect, that you're actually hurting yourself. It's very, I mean, I think it underscores almost in a way how, you know, it's one of those, it's like the old joke, like, if you're going to attack, like, a place, like, you don't just go up to the front door and ring the bell. And how many times have you watched a movie where they even have the line, like, oh, we'll just go in through the front door and ring the bell or whatever. Like, it's you know, that old gag, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
No, and this is where we start to get that divergence of perspective, don't we? Because especially where Anaris gets killed, we get Larash and Riffin, if I'm right. I hope I've got that right.
That sounds right.
The two rogues who kill, I think Riffin's the one who actually kills the commander. But from the Alliance perspective, we don't know anything. We just see this elf and this undead rogue come out the trees. They kill the commander. They quickly butcher a couple of sentinels, and then they Larash gets away. Riffin doesn't necessarily, but it's great that, you know, when you see the Horde perspective of this, you see the whole build up of that one particular moment, which I absolutely loved. Like visiting a good war afterwards, just seeing actually the conversation that Riffin and Larash were having about, you know, where do we attack, how do we attack, you know, how Larash was getting worried that he couldn't hear from Riffin. So yeah, that was a really good turning point in the novella for me. But if anything, what that whole segment told me was just how brutal the attack was. You're right, Katie. We play through it, but I don't think playing through it actually carried the weight of how can I put it? How coordinated, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, this was, or how surgical, I think was the word I was going to go for, because you hear the tales that I think Southang makes a comment. He says by now they're marching up towards Ashenvale, and he reckons, you know, he notes the time, and then he goes, by now the first attack should be going on. And just that understanding that, you know, somewhere else all of these other attacks are happening and there's no way of stopping them, there's no way. And that was a really good perspective in conflict, because I think too often as characters in WoW, we get put at the center, and too often we get this impression that all the action happens around us, and if it's not happening around us, then it doesn't happen. But I would love to see more stuff like this in the game, where actually, you know what, the conflict is happening there, you're not going to be there, but just let you know it's actually happening. Complete sidetrack on my part, but I really like that in the book. So yeah, that was my point. I don't know where I was going with it, other than the fact I really liked it.
So
I suppose the
go ahead.
No, go.
Okay, well, I was just going to say, on that note where we're talking about the coordinated attacks, it was really fun reading both perspectives, because on the Horde side, you have this, you know, you have the two rogues that are planning and being very surgical. They're like, okay, all of this is going to happen, like, we're trying to make sure that all these coordinated attacks happen at the same time, so that, you know, we really catch them off guard. And so you watch this, as you were saying, this very surgical procedure on the Horde side, and then on the Alliance side, you just get this sheer sense of terror, right? Because they have no idea what's happening. Yep. Like, they really hit it home. They're like, what's going on? People are suddenly dying. Like, just the terror of, you know, these coordinated surgical attacks that they weren't expecting. I thought they did a really excellent job of just really distilling that down to make you feel both sides very precisely. Like, this goes very well on the Horde side, this is absolutely terrifying on the Alliance side, and they actually try, and introduce an element of terror. Like, the Horde specifically tries to do that to make the Alliance, at least the elves, kind of disoriented and confused and scared. And it was really tough reading the Alliance side after I read the Horde side, because I'm like, I know what's going to happen. I feel like a horrible person. This is really painful for me to read. Also, being an elf player, I'm like, it's right in the feels, and everyone's going to die. But it was definitely props. It was excellent storytelling, and it was really hard to read.
See, but that's something where I don't know if I picked up on that necessarily, because I knew what the Horde had done originally and like how this was all playing out. And maybe it could just be extreme Horde bias on my part as well. But yeah, I think that scene plays out differently depending on which one you read first, because either you know exactly what's happening or you don't. And I think, if you don't, that's a whole different level of horror than what you're expecting otherwise.
Yeah.
Totally, and that's what I felt, because you don't see these characters. The conflict starts instantly with the Inaris dying, pretty much, and then it very quickly deteriorates from that. And you're right, Nick, that you don't have that perspective. You have no understanding about where this attack's coming from or how it's been placed within the other aspects of the conflict. And Christy Golden doesn't give you any more information than what Delarin sees in her immediate vicinity. The story very much follows her perspective, occasionally Ferrins and one or two other major characters, but pretty much you are localized to Delarin and her understanding of what is happening. And I think that would be, I'm not saying it's the only way to read it, but that is what I think is a great thing about reading Elegy first, that you see the shock and horror of conflict and you experience that just the lack of information that comes with that conflict before seeing all the context behind it. That's just me, though. I completely understand what you said, though.
Well, and
so just a quick question: when you were reading Elegy first, like, did you have any idea? I mean, obviously, you know the greater thread of the plot, but when you're reading about, like, it's like, Sarfang and Sylvanas are I guess Sarfang and Nathanos are at odds, and they get into that fight in the one brawl. Like, did you have any idea like that was fake, or were you like, what are they building here? Like, what exactly were your thoughts on that? At what point did you realize, like, that was all misdirection, or did you not realize it was misdirection until you got to that part in A Good War?
That's a good question. I don't think I saw it as deliberate, and I think that's why I brought up the criticism of Southang. I don't think I saw it as deliberate and planned as it turned out to be. From my perspective, I think it was, I guess I saw it as characters kind of seeing the understanding but not coming round to it. But no, I think I was somewhere in the middle. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. But I think the real the shock comes into it where, certainly in the later stages of the book, where you're starting to see, I don't know, it's more the peripheral things, if that makes sense. Like, the way the fleet crumbles, and then you go in the Alliance side, you hear about the fleet crumbling and what's happening there. But then it's only when you see the Horde side, you see actually how the Horde defeat the fleet. And actually, you hear about characters, the sailors, bless them, who are forced to sail back to Teldrassil, because otherwise they're just forced to drown, basically. And you just sit there and think, Jesus, like, all this stuff you just don't appreciate in that initial Elegy story. I think that's what took me back. So maybe what I guess I'm trying to say is you only really get that potency from Elegy when you read A Good War, but then I guess that's kind of the trap that they're trying to set up for you in some ways. But yeah, somewhere in between, I guess, is my cop-out answer. But moving along slightly, because we're about halfway, and I realise we've spoken for about 50 minutes or so on the story. As things progress and the initial attacks happen and the Horde starts to push in to Ashenvale, were there any things in particular that really stood out for you? I've got a few thoughts, but I'll let you guys speak first.
I think the thing that stood out, and this is maybe a little bit overall as well, but reading A Good War first, and me and my horrible faction bias I have going on here, like, it, in some ways you kind of, like, they do a good job, as I kind of already mentioned, of really instilling the feelings of both sides. So, like, on the Horde side, like, yeah, like, we're, kicking butt, like, you kind of, the worst way, you kind of feel good. You're like, oh yeah, like, we're winning, and this is good, and they're pushing through, and they're being successful, and all these attacks are working, and then, like, you're like, okay, like, this feels good. Like, we're pushing through Ashenvale. No one's stopping us. Like, we got this. It's great. But then you read the Elegy, the Alliance side, and you're like, holy crap, like the terror that's happening. You're like, oh my gosh, I kind of almost forgot this was a war, that we're murdering people and that we're just attacking these people that weren't even expecting us. It's not really fair. It's not super honorable. So Sourfang is a little bit of a hypocrite, perhaps, in more than one way. But it's just the stark difference. Like, you feel, as a Horde player, again, you at least I did, I felt kind of like, oh yeah, like we're winning and it feels good because that's how the Horde feels. Like, yeah, we're winning this battle because we need a good battle to win. A good war. You know, we need something to help rally the troops and make them feel good and successful, even though we just kicked the Burning Legion, and I don't know why that wouldn't make them all happy. But it's just so different reading it on the Alliance side, and you kind of realize what a horrible person you were, because you're like, oh yeah, like this felt so good as a Horde player, and then you're like, oh god, I'm a terrible person. Like, I'm just gonna go and hide over here in the corner because my faction burnt a giant world tree, and that's totally a good thing. So anyway, Nick, I'll hand it off to you. I'm curious to see what your thoughts were. If you had the kind of same, like, oh, it feels good, and then you're like, oh, this is horrible, and we're awful people.
Well, I think the problem is that, like, we knew what was coming at the end of this, so it was hard to, and again, I want to say we were reading this. This was after Old Soldier came out, I think, right?
I think I read it before Old Soldier. Yeah, it was around the same time.
Or maybe it was right before. It might have been right before.
I think I read A Good War, then Old Soldier came out, and then I read Elegy. So I think they were like, they were around the same time. So I think.
Okay, so it's. I just remember that. It's one of those things. It's like, okay, like, but okay, so like they're not going to burn the tree, but how are they going to burn the tree? They're not going to burn the tree, but how? When's that turn gonna? And no, but we had seen the Warbringer, so we knew exactly what that point was. But it's just. It's one of those things where I think you try to, as you're reading this, you're always putting like, well, where's my character fitting into this? Like, what am I doing? You know, I hope I'm not one of those people that like rushed the wisp wall because they didn't fare very well.
Yeah.
But you know, it's just like, am I like Bane in the Lordaeron cinematic where I'm like I'm saying for the Horde through gritted teeth, or am I out there like rah rah? Let's mess some people up here, and I think it's one of those like you're like, okay, I can go along with this, and then I think, like I said, like with Sourfang. Like his response to the burning of the tree, I think that's really where you're like, okay, like this was sort of like where my character is going to be like, okay, I'm going to walk away with my head held in shame after what happened here. Like, I'm not thrilled by the events.
Go ahead.
No, what were you saying?
I was just gonna say, I think that you're right? Because I would say, as a Horde character, depending on how your character views the current events. It's one of those where you're like, okay, like, even to a certain point, I feel like a lot of our characters are like, okay, yeah, we can fight people that can fight back, but the second that changes, that narrative changes to, you're murdering people that can't fight you, you're like, oh, this is not so good. Like, I'm just gonna go, because this is, we did something real bad, and we're sorry. So we're gonna have this nice little hand-drawn card and send it to Tirana, like, sorry, we made you sad. But, no, go ahead.
The one part of the context in all this is it's always like, again, this was back during the great morally gray debate. And so you're going along with the Horde side and you're like, okay, like we've got some people on the Horde side that clearly have, I don't want to say they have no morals, but they have less morals than other people.
Yeah.
And there's really no chance for anybody on the Alliance side to show their lack of compunction about certain things.
Yes.
Like anything that the Alliance does in retaliation is justified because they're the ones under assault.
Yes.
They're the ones under threat. So no matter how desperate the Alliance gets, it's okay because they're defending.
We struck first.
And so it just makes it a bit hard to be like, oh, like like as a Horde, like you're tolerating a lot and you're like, I'm going along with a lot and just, yeah, it's I think it's a lot easier for the Alliance side to get their feathers ruffled and be like, okay, like let's go kick some Horde teeth in because, yeah, like you earned that. we like Sourfang said, like like they're coming now, all of them. Like you should be coming for us, and so yeah, it's not the Horde's finest day, I guess is probably the way to put it.
No.
Yeah, and I think in some ways that hindsight plays into that. We'll see how that event plays out in the rest of the expansion, but I wouldn't say it's not necessarily the Horde. I guess maybe it isn't the Horde's finest day, but I don't think it's that one moment in the story. We're jumping a bit ahead, but it's that one flick, and I can't. It's really well told in A Good War. The way everyone is just shocked at that phrase "burn it," and I don't think Warbringer really did enough to carry it. And maybe because they knew the book was going to do it, but you know, in the Warbringer, Sylvanas' Warbringer video, she does that. She says "burn it." You see Nathanos, looking down at Delarin, and he kind of just doesn't quite register it. He looks up, and I picked up on that. But in the book, Saurfang's response is brilliant because he doesn't understand the words she's saying, and he doesn't get what's happening. He registers Nathanos. Sorry, I'm going to keep mispronouncing that, but he registers that she says something, and then he moves, and then the catapults start flying, and he just doesn't realise what is happening. And so I don't think it's the Horde's... It's not their lowest moment, is what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. I think the Horde is equally shot. There's a moment where the boat that's been taken by some of those Horde soldiers who have swam out to the fleet, which is a brilliant section in its own right. But we'll come back to that in a second. But when that is sailing towards Teldrassil and then it suddenly backs off, I think that just carries the message that the Horde just as a unison did not understand what was happening. So I guess it's more Sylvanas' authority over perhaps just the authority in that moment that carried through.
Well, I think Saurfang especially is hit by that because he's the one guy who knew what was going on.
Yes.
I mean, him, Nathanos, and Sylvanas, the three of them, this was their plan. And so everybody else, like, just a few hours before, I think what happens over, like, 2 or 3 days, like they had the rug pulled out from under them when they're like, yeah, let's go to Silithus. Yeah, let's go to Ashenvale. Like, so they already knew, things can shift on a dime, and they've just kind of got to roll with it. But Saurfang was like the one guy, like, no, this is the plan. This is what we're doing. I have everything under control here. I'm getting my little 15-minute cat naps when I can. Everything's good. And all of a sudden, like, Sylvanas pulled rank on him. And it's one of those things where, not that I think he would have ever questioned, like, no, the war chief is above him. Like, he understands that. But for like at that point, you have to wonder, like, one, like, there still has to be some fundamental, like, distrust. Like, yeah, she's a banshee. She's Sylvanas. She's always kind of had her own agenda. Like, what does that mean? And then for her to sort of go out, like, was this always the plan? And I mean, we've even argued this, knowing and having seen Warbringers and seen the little conversation in the flashback. Like, we've argued, like, at what point did Sylvanas realize, like, she was going to have to burn that tree? Like, we're arguing that as observers who have a lot more, like, omniscient knowledge than Saurfang as a character does. Like, now he's got to be sitting there like, how much was I complicit in this by letting it get this far? I mean, I let her bring the catapults right to the shore, and then she said fire. Like, he's not innocent in that. And at what point was he supposed to have, like, reined her in to prevent that from happening? I mean, he's going to be stuck answering that question for I think when you look at old soldier and he's thinking of the screams and the people burning in the tree, like, that's got to be weighing on him at that point, that he, it's not like Sylvanas said burn it, it's all on her. Like, he helped her get to that point.
Well, and I think in the Horde narrative, at least, that's when everything comes to this screaming halt, right? Because you're like, oh, we feel so good, we're going through the forest, like, we're kicking everyone's butt. You feel bad for, like, burning the forest and stuff, but on the Horde side, it's very, like, rah, rah, Horde, like, yeah, you're kicking butt, and we're it's a good war. Until we get to Teldrassil, and then everything, like, one of the coolest things about just the novel itself is you have Saurfang and Nathanos just talking to each other, like, yeah, look, so we're gonna take a boat over, and then we're gonna do some stuff. Like, they're sitting there planning it together, and then just, like, burn it, and they're both like, what? Like, what? I'm sorry, what did you say? Did you stutter? And she's like, did I stutter? Burn the tree. And you're like, oh. And then he does it, and yeah, again, Saurfang's, like, totally blindsided, and I think it's really interesting to watch his character just kind of be like, I'm not in control of the situation, and it's like one of the first times in a very long time he hasn't been. And I almost wonder if this is, like, keep bringing his child back in some way, because he wasn't in control of that situation, and that really weighs on him, and he doesn't like not being in control. So, yeah, that was hard. That was, as a Horde player, you're just like, oh, I know it's gonna happen. I keep hoping something different. Like, keep hoping the narrative will change. Like, I don't know, maybe Deathwing's gonna pop out of the ground and be like, hey, just kidding, guys, I'm not dead, and then burns the tree, and I'm like, oh, see, it was Deathwing all along. Like, you guys thought it was Sylvanas, but it's really Deathwing.
Well, Ashara could have put it out, so it's really Ashara's fault, to be honest.
It's always Ashara's fault. I was hoping that she was sitting over there with like a butane torch, was like, haha, I'm going to burn the tree, and then like, oh, it was the Horde that did it. I'm like, but she's right there.
That was a theory at one point, wasn't it?
That was my favorite theory. I was hoping that was what was going to happen, and it didn't.
Well, we jumped ahead, and I think it's right we jump ahead because obviously time's going on, and we're talking about Teldrassil, and I want to talk about Sylvanas' motivations, and we haven't even got into the burning scene in, or I guess the whole evacuation of Teldrassil in the Alliance side of the story. So before we go to that, is there anything about the build up to Teldrassil from the Horde's perspective? Maybe the Alliance's, if you count Delarin's story and Malfurion's role in that sort of thing. Is there anything about that captures your attention? Obviously, we haven't got enough time to pack it all in, but any highlights in particular? So
I have just a really brief one that kind of struck me, and it's a very tiny. It's basically a footnote, but the Blood Elf rogue. When Larash, yes, when he uses his justification for attacking Malfurion, he's like, oh yeah, like, it wasn't imagined, right? Because it's like, oh, the Night Elves left the Blood Elves, essentially, to fend for their own thing, and I was like, but, like, I apologize, it wasn't very much a footnote, but it's interesting that he uses that as a justification for attacking, like, they gave us the motivations why other races were upset, and I guess we'd never really seen that kind of conflict prior, like, it was just interesting that they brought it up in their help recreating narratives of why the Horde and Alliance really don't like each other, races that we normally don't hear from being upset, like the Blood Elves. It was like, oh, they have motivation, they hate the Night Elves, this is why. And I was like, oh, I guess that's like a really, like, it was a footnote, but it helped really punch home that peace is going to be difficult, especially after this, but even at that, we always think, oh, we just took down this giant, boss or whatever in the Warcraft, and the world is good, but it's not. There's so much underneath all of the characters, there's so much shifting feelings and hurt that has been there, and this really drove that home for me, that I was like, oh, like, everyone's good, like, we're good now. It's like, no, there's a lot of hurt feelings, and some of these things will never be forgiven. So
didn't he even like call Malfurion out on that?
Yeah.
Malfurion was like, were you even born at that time?
Exactly. Yeah, that was also funny.
Like where are you getting this from? Like you were just like, you were a kid, like, shut up. But and then he kills him.
Yeah. But I mean, like, it was interesting because he's like, oh, I lived through this really difficult period. I was a child, but, like, these were the things I had to live through. And it's one of those things where, Malfurion, I kind of feel like is mirroring a player at that point. It's like, well, I mean, I thought everything was good because I'm a player and I see everything in a very broad spectrum. But when you narrow and distill it down into different races, different events, things that we always forget about because they were either before World of Warcraft actually happened as a game, or, they were so long ago, we just don't think about them. And sometimes they're more recent, but they tend to get overshadowed by events that we, the player, are interacting with, like the Burning Legion or Deathwing or whatever. But I thought that was a really interesting thing that they hit home on, is that there are, I would say, normal denizens. They're like, hey, these horrible things have happened to me. I'm blaming you, and that's why there cannot be peace. And so I was like, oh, yeah, that hits home in the worst way. I'm like, I guess not. Like, I thought we were all going to be friends, and we're definitely not. So, feels bad, man.
I think it's more than just the Forsaken who will never forgive and never forget.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was only going to say, I think to add to that, I think, other than the fact that this Blood Elf rogue thought that he could take on Malfurion, I think one of the, and that was never going to go well to begin with, but I think the message it taught me was that, how they always talk about a cycle of conflict, and how with this particular encounter, and you bring it up, Nick, that Malfurion questions whether Larash was even alive to experience the slights against his people that he perceives as grounds for conflict. In some ways, that captures this idea that the views of the old, Sao Fang, Malfurion, the people who fought conflicts will carry younger people into it, and in that sense, it kind of perpetuates itself because then the young are involved in conflicts, which they will then project onto younger generations. And I think that's something interesting, because what it builds up is this perspective that at some point the Night Elves may have to forgive for what happens to Teldrassil on the basis that the Horde was maybe just following orders, or maybe, just because the Horde burnt down Teldrassil, is every Horde soldier or every Horde citizen liable for that crime, even though they never put the torch to it? It was one person who ordered it, but should everyone suffer because of it? But yeah, on the other side of it, it is one Blood Elf rogue trying to gank the strongest druid on the planet.
You've never seen like an elite rare, and you're like, well, I got all my potions, I got everything on cooldown, I can do this, and then you just realize that was a mistake. Like,
My entire vanilla WoW experience.
Yeah.
Just
but then
there.
Chickers just leaves group at the last minute.
Exactly.
That was one of my favorites. He's like, you do you, man, because I am not doing like that's like the perfect player dichotomy. Someone's like, yeah, we're gonna go kill that rare, and it's like, I don't think that's just a skull boss. It's like, yeah, but we're gonna kill it. You're like, I don't think that's a good. I'm just gonna take my giant crab pet. We're gonna just like kind of Hunter disappear in the background. They're like, "Come on, Hunter, we can do it." And then just like, Hunter, the Hunter's gone. You're like, no. But anyway, no,
Clearly,
if Blizzard hadn't nerfed the looking for group tool for world bosses,
he would have
been able to wait and get a group and then get on another server and take them down. But
that's it.
Nope.
Never mind. Yeah, again, there's so many things in that section. We couldn't possibly cover it all in this episode. I think there's highlights for me. There's that scene where that night elf, again, there's a lot of rogue action, but that rogue who conceals himself as the undead, I think that's a beautiful scene where he tries to infiltrate Southang's inner council, and it all just goes horribly wrong. But again, going back to that perspective, you got Delarin on Elegy looking and going, she doesn't know what's happening, and then she suddenly sees Southang just come out screaming and sort of goes at him, and then you read A Good War and you see exactly why that went so wrong, because unfortunately that particular Night Elf rogue didn't quite play his cards right.
That was hard to read, having read A Good War first, because they're like, oh, I know exactly how this goes, and you're just like, the whole time you're just like, oh, like, yeah. Again, you're like hoping for like a different outcome than what's there, and you're just like, get out, and you're just like, because again, when you read it, especially reading A Good War first, when that happens, you're like, it takes you a minute to be like, wait a minute, like something's not right here, and then you realize everything, and then it's like, oh, like, yeah, when he's like, oh, I'll go in under disguise, you're like, no, don't do that.
It's like, yeah, I think it's almost more difficult reading A Good War first, because if you read Eulogy first, you're like, oh, well, I don't know if any of these characters are gonna die or not, and in Good War, it's like, oh, everybody dies, and I'm like,
yeah.
This feels like a Christine Golden novel, because anyone you care about just dies, and you're like, in the fields, just constantly in the fields. But yeah, go ahead.
On that, and reading Elegy first, I knew it was never going to go well. There was no way it was going to go well. But you don't know why it's not going well, and it's that lack of knowledge that builds the suspense. And I think reading A Good War afterwards, obviously you see this guy walk in, you know what's going to happen to him. But in some ways, I seemed more sympathetic because, actually, I don't know, going back on it now, I'm actually starting to redraw my knowledge. The thing they play up in Elegy is his youth. And I think in A Good War, they talk about his youth and his naivety. And I think there's a moment where Southang kills him, and he's this near enough, in his 20s by comparison to a human age or something like that. And he's dying, and he still is defiant and spits on Southang, if I've got that right. And I just think, the perspective was just actually really well played. But I think I liked not having that knowledge. Personally, I think walking into it, having A Good War afterwards definitely helped a little bit more. But similarly, what I was trying to say was you have the same issue with Ferrin, in that Ferrin is killed off in one of the most brutal ways possible. He just, he thinks he's got a stab at Southang, although I don't think it's Southang at the time, but he goes for him and just, has his head cut off. He doesn't even realise he's been killed until he starts to see his head, or the perspective of his head, roll off. But what struck me is how that is just barely a footnote in A Good War. It's just Southang's like walking around and goes, oh, there's someone in there. They're dead. Anyways, back to the main story. And I just thought, you just killed off one of the Alliance novella's main characters, and you haven't even acknowledged it. And again, perspective, just how the big moments for one particular character are just trivial for others. I think that was just such a brilliant thing that played out in the novella overall. Any final thoughts before we go on to Teldrassil?
I think you pretty much summed it up perfectly. That just the feeling of it being a footnote to one character, but then you kill off a major character. Like, that was just so difficult to go through both sides. And yeah, reading a good war first, you're like, oh, it's just a druid. Or like, I think one of the parts that was really difficult for me to read was, I believe it was the Blood Elf Rogue again, whose name I keep forgetting, it starts with an L. Larash, thank you. Where Larash is in the tree and all of those druids are running by, right, in their cat form, and he's just murdering them. And then reading it on both sides, it's just like, oh, I know what's gonna happen. I feel really bad because I know who all of these druids are now. I'm like, yeah. So I totally agree with your perspective. It's.
And that's another point for Elegy. When you read that first, you don't have a clue what's happening. Like, even reading it doesn't make sense what's happening. Farron is so caught off guard that he can't even really express on the page what's happening. So he just moves on quickly. He realizes he's got something bigger to do. He has to leave them. But when you get to a good war, you understand what has actually happened and why it's happened. So, yeah, again, really nicely played out.
Excellent story.
But we'll move on to Teldrassil. And I wanted to talk about, just very quickly, and I realize it's somewhat a big topic, Sylvanas' motivations for burning down Teldrassil, because that could be covered in a few minutes.
Yes, sure. Absolutely. It's a footnote, really. It's not very important.
It's a footnote, really. But I think very much towards the end of the Good War, there's that moment, and I kind of picked this up in the Warbringer video, where Sylvanas realizes her plan is so surgical and so clinical that she understands it is purely motivated towards breaking the spirit of the Night Elves. And I think something that happens in the Warbringer video is that, and it's played out in colours really well, the blue of Dalarin in that video is played out well with the blue of Teldrassil, and I think in that video Sylvanas is seen to equate the hope that Dalarin has that Sylvanas will be overcome, with the fact that Teldrassil still stands. In this one, it kind of twists it, because what actually happens is that Sylvanas realises that because Southang didn't do his job and Malfurion will survive, they will never lose hope while Teldrassil remains as it is. In other words, she has to inflict a deeper wound than Malfurion's death would have caused, and that's what pushes her to burn Teldrassil. It's almost an act of desperation. She realizes the game is up. She's kind of done this for nothing. Although, again, the plan never makes any reference to killing I know the plan is to kill Malfurion, but it's not. It doesn't seem built strategically to lure Malfurion out and kill him. It seems just to push Teldrassil to the edge. But I just thought that was really well done. The fact that she just realizes that she's got to do this, because otherwise she's lost. Ironically, she's captured the city, but she still loses the conflict, or at least the purpose for it. I don't know if you guys picked up on that, or maybe on that chapter you interpreted her motivations a little bit differently.
Well, I think there's really two things at play here. One is that the flaw in the plan is Sorfang's honor, as it were.
Yeah.
That's the crux upon which all of this winds up resting, and that's what fails. And then, so it's one of those things, like if Sorfang had known, like, hey, if you let Malfurion live, like, Sylvanas is going to burn Teldrassil, like, how does he play that moment back? Because, again, going back to what I said earlier about him, like, knowing, like, he contributed so much to this, again, that's another point where this all falls on his shoulders. And, it's a little bit rude to say, like, well, because you did this, somebody else did something horrible, but at the same time, like, yeah, because you did something nice, somebody else did something horrible. But the other part of that is, there's the part in Elegy, because where she whispers into... Actually, no, I think it's actually, that part's actually not in Elegy. That's in the Warbringers, where at the end of, like, Sylvanas' flashback, when she lights the tree, she whispers to Dalaran, like, now you understand. And then we get Delaran's reaction to that in Elegy when she's like, I understand nothing. And that was Sylvanas' point. Like, you go back to that whole, like, what we are nothing but slaves to this torment. Like, Sylvanas is almost like the ultimate nihilist. Like, there's nothing, like, you like, all we're trying to do is understand the world and put it all into some kind of order, and there's no point to that. All it is pain. And and so basically she's like, I'm just going to inflict, like, the biggest amount of pain upon you that I can, because it's like, that's what it took to break me, and now I'm going to do the same thing to break you.
Yes.
And I mean, again, it goes back to the Warbringers, where she was like pulling the mascara down on Dalaran to give her the same kind of tear marks that Sylvanas has and whatnot. But and personally, I'd love it if we find out that she actually like resurrected her as a banshee somewhere. Like Delaran could be Sylvanas 2.0. I mean, that'd be a little cliche, but I'd be a sucker for that. I don't care. But it's like Sylvanas. Just I mean, it's one of those things where I feel like a lot of the Forsaken, like, are like fake goths. Like they're people who are like, oh, like life is hard or everything, but like they go home and they have like nice suburban parents and everything's fine for them. And they don't really know suffering. But Sylvanas is the one. She's really like she's cutting herself and she's like way deep into stuff. Like, you know, she's not just like a Smiths fan. She's really like she really has problems, and I feel like she has no hope to the point that she wants to steal hope from everybody else. It's that vicious. I mean, when Delaran says like you've chosen to go to war against life, it's not even life. It's
happiness.
It's hope, happiness, just everything. Like, and it's one of those things where it's like we question like how much like. With like we know like Illyria is working with the void, as it were, but Sylvanas is almost working with like the emotional void. Like there is just nothing there. Like, you know, it's not even like her heart is like 2 sizes too small. It's like her heart is gone. It's obliterated, and so she's just. I mean, it's not that she. I don't want to say that she can't be redeemed. I have no idea what Blizzard has in store for her, but. She is just at the depths of misery and suffering and just utter nothingness. I mean,
it's wonderful, isn't it?
It is. It's terrible as it is. I mean, it's great, and I don't know. I think that's the most fascinating aspect of her character at this point.
Well, I think one of the cool things that they brought up yet again in A Good War, and I don't think they really touched on it in Elegy because you don't get any perspective on Sylvanas, but they also touched on this a little bit in Before the Storm as well, is that she doesn't really feel most emotions anymore. The ones that she really does feel are pretty much anger. Anger and hate are the 2 things that she can still feel. And we know from some Forsaken narratives, not many, but the ones that do... that choose to lock out good emotions just become kind of consumed by like 1 or 2 bad emotions. Like I'm trying to remember what her name is. The old lady Forsaken that's like, oh dear, like the really nice granny.
Valcinda?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, exactly, Valcinda. You know, she was the one saying like, oh, it really poisons the hearts of Forsaken if they feel negative emotions and they continue to feel negative emotions. And I'm like, this is what we're seeing with Sylvanas on a large scale, right? Like she has so desperately cut out hope and anything, so she's just she's a toxic player. She's a toxic player. So by Blizzard's own rules, she's gonna have to get booted. I'm sorry. I love you, Sylvanas. I hope that you have a redemption arc, but right now I'm like, you're making the whole team uncomfortable.
I stick with my merchandise logic that Blizzard has never made a statue for any WoW character whose story has not in some way concluded in the expansion in which the statue was released. So I think her story will be concluded. I don't think she will die, but I think maybe sort of redemption is on the horizon. Who knows? Anyways, I do think that's a really nice bit, and again, I think it's hyped up for Cao Fang's shock. But I think one of the things that stood out for me was the fact that she realizes she's made a mistake.
Yes.
And the crucial thing for that is that despite, and you make a really great point there, Nick, that despite her nihilistic tendencies, her feeling that she has the world sussed out, she's still fallible, sorry, I should say, in that she can get things wrong. And I think that is the thing that will probably be played on most in Battle for Azeroth. Her trips, how she trips herself up rather than how anyone actually gets the better of her, because I think her overconfidence is probably the thing that's going to bring her down, but that's a story we'll have to wait and see. I want to move on to the evacuation of Teldrassil, because we've kind of skipped over large parts of the Alliance story, but a large part of it is played out in that evacuation. And there's a lot of things we could bring up, like, well, for one, the how the portals work. I know they make a reference, I think it's kind of a Get Out reference as to how you can't move armies through portals quickly, but you could evacuate cities, apparently. I don't know how that works.
But not even that. I think it's just like the size, just as far as how quickly you get people through there. I mean, it was a bottleneck, and clearly we didn't get everybody out of Teldrassil, which is the the heartbreaking part. That was just hard to read.
Hard to read, and it was hard to play. Like, they made you play that on the Alliance side, and I actually had to take... I don't want to go too far into it, but as someone that started as a night elf, I'm like, it took me at least a good couple, like, week or two to, like, work up the ability. Be like, I know I'm gonna have to go in that city. I know it's gonna be burning down. I actually started crying while I was doing the quest. I was like, this is so painful that I don't want to do it. And then I did it, and I was like, this is awful. Like, feels bad, man. But it was hard to read, too, because, I mean, they make you do it again, and you're like, this is the worst, and everything hurts, and I don't want to read this page, but I did.
Well, in some ways, I wonder if they could have I realized they had a 3-week window to tell the story of the War of Thorns and Lordaeron, but, you know, in some ways, I wish they had taken that story and expanded it over several weeks worth of content, because the evacuation is brutal. Absolutely brutal. The way that, again, you say, Nick, it's bottlenecked, but I think more importantly, the way that Mia, for example, has she works her wonders on the other side, the panic that Gen feels, he's sending letters to Mia like, get out as quickly as you can, and there's that realization when I read that particular passage that, they knew they weren't going to save everyone, and at some point, and Anduin does it in the end, although he kind of gets saved from making the harsh decision in himself, but they realize at some point they're going to have to turn off the portals, and enough will be enough. And well, again, I think there's so many emotions at play as to, what's happening. But go on, Nick, sorry.
I was going to say, that's what I like when the smoke started coming through the portals. Like, you forget, like, it's not just the people they can go through. Like, they have a portal open to a fire, basically, at that point. Like, they needed to close it for themselves. And that's just... that whole sequence was just... Even... I know you mentioned, like, bringing it out over a few weeks. I think the harshness of that sequence is because of how short it is.
Yes.
That... Like, to extend it, it gives you more opportunity to, like, okay, there's got to be a way I can get, like, at least 100 of these people, if not all 982. Like, no, it's like you have, like, it's all snap decisions that you have to go through to get as many as you can. That timer counts down so maliciously.
So bad.
It's
right in the field.
I'm just glad, like, the one thing when I played through it, I was like, what are they talking about with this kid? Like, Gen shows up and, like, Mia's yelling about this kid. And I'm like, does Gen have another kid we didn't, like, what? And, like, I'm glad that they explained it. What was the kid's name? They named him Fennel or something, like, as the last night elf to like, be born in Teldrassil. Like, that was just, again, another gut punch. Like, that was all just, and that's the kind of thing where I wonder if they're not, like, we saw Anduin grow up in this game. We know that Thrall's kids are now, like, grade school age, running around. Like, we're probably not too far from them. They're roughly around the age when Anduin started. So we're not, like, we're maybe 10 years away from Thrall's kids actually starting to, like, play a prominent role in the Horde. Like, is Fennel in, like, 15, 20 years, if they, I don't know if they want to accelerate Night Elf age or something. I don't know how many expansions down the line will be. Is he going to wind up, like, being a major Night Elf character at some point? Because, I mean, if you want to talk about having the ability to, like, rally the Night Elves, I mean, just your name says you were the last Night Elf from Teldrassil. Like, that alone, like, you, just by existing, you represent so much to this race that is now effectively homeless. But then again, they've been homeless before, so they can...
But the question is, when he's potentially leading parts of the Night Elf faction, will he hold, young Horde soldiers to the same crime that their elders committed, arguably? And I think you're right. That's going to be an interesting story. Whether we're around long enough to see it. That's
Lorash, though.
Yes,
that's Lorash, who he's still going after Malfurion for something that happened before he was born. So it's that. I mean, that's really something I hadn't even realized till we talked about it here, that they've done a very good job of, like, just weaving this whole, like, these preordained racial hatreds that just run deep through people. And I mean, we sit there at the character screen, we choose our faction, we choose our race because, hey, this looks cool. And, we don't realize, at least within the story, like, how deep these go. I mean, to sit there, I mean, and this is something where, go back to Before the Storm, when Sylvanas was all like, I wish Bane would just join the Alliance. Like, given, like, the Horde's actions here, I mean, as much as Bane wasn't at the burning. I mean, if he showed up and said to Anduin, like, hey, I know we used to be friends, but can you bring us in? I mean, Tyrande, we know Tyrande can hold a grudge. And so, like,
yeah, she kind of
would she... Yeah, would she be like, yeah, you bring them in, like there's going to be trouble? Like it really underscores the World of Warcraft, that the war, because it's one of those things. I mean, every time we get a Legion, we get the Mist of Pandaria cinematic, like the orc and the human are fighting. Oh, here's some new threat. Just take the spear and let's work together now. Like they're willing to drop that at the as soon as something shows up, but no, not really. They still hold on to that stuff. They still hold on to that stuff.
You never know. Fennel might hold it against the Draenei that they never bothered to turn up, and
right,
which is interesting, right? Like that was one of those things where it's like, oh, like the Draenei were never they never showed up, they never helped, and it's like, okay, are they even there? Like I'm not even that was like one of those weird points where I'm like, okay, I'm not sure. Like, if the Draenei are even here, or are they all crammed on a ship somewhere? Like, I don't really know how much the Blood Isles and Azure Mist in general is, like, populated by Draenei, but... So that kind of feels weird in the first spot, but...
The Vindicar's got to be floating around somewhere.
I guess! I mean,
last time I checked, that was pretty quick at getting around planets, so...
But if it's floating around, then that means there's a chance that Draenei can crash it. So the best thing they can do is just leave it on the ground, and if they never take off, then it can't come back down.
God, imagine if that's how Teldrassil burned, because the Vindicar got crashed into it. Just poor Draenei parking.
you get like it's like the cinematic with Jaina with the ship showing up, except it's the Vindicar, and then they're like, yay, the Draenei are here, and then just goes right into the tree.
Velen's like, oh, I can't control this thing. One thing I wanted to say though, and it's something I've picked up on in a different video. I think this is where the artwork kind of takes the story to a whole new level. So at the start of Chapter 5, which is called Conflagration. God, I can't even say English words. Jesus, it's not particularly good. But the opening chapter of that is mirrored by this really amazing image of the evacuation. So you've got the Night Elf, the portals to... Teldrassil and the Night Elf citizens pouring out just in front of the citadel. And something that struck me is at the very top you get these beautiful image of the gusts blowing through, and you're right, Nick. Not only are you getting these smoke flowing through the city, but you're basically opening up a portal to another, a furnace raging on the other side of Azeroth, and just that image in itself, just because that never gets mentioned in the book. Really, you get a mention about the smoke, but it never gets mentioned just what an impact this is having on just the weather system around Stormwind. And in some ways, I wish they had mentioned it. But again, it shows why the art in this particular hard copy version just elevates what's happening to a whole new level, and that plays out across all the art. The artwork in this book is absolutely fantastic. But to me, that's when it started to really just grab a new energy of its own. And yeah, I really, really liked it. The other things I just want to talk about on the evacuation. So there's a lot of depressing points. You've got the Night Elves throwing themselves into the fountains because they'll do anything to escape the heat, and you get a lot of negative stuff. But I think it's the closing section that I think is worth pondering over, because after all, it does really close off the story. But the priestesses, who, and I cannot remember, is it Astari? Yeah, I think it's
that sounds right.
Yeah, Astari, who realizes she's not going to go through. She speaks to Mia, I think, at one point. Mia knows her well, and she accepts that I'm not going through this portal, so I'm going to stay with those who are left behind. And to say it's a powerful image is completely an understatement. But to me, what struck me about this, and guys, feel free to jump in on that whole end part of the story, anything that captures your attention. But for me, it's the song she starts to sing at the end. So she does this By the Moon's Glow Listen, and the song that opens up the beginning of Elegy. And what struck me is that you never see the end of it. It ends on to the whisper of the wind over the silent dead. However, you get the rest of the story from Tyrande, and that's where she finishes off that song that you see at the very beginning of the book. And to me, that was just a really beautiful note, because it's very subtle, but what it says to me is that as you can expect from Fidel, or Finel, sorry, not Fidel, Finel, in the role he plays. Yeah, I have to go down a completely different route there. But to me, it just carried this sense of hope continuing, which is exactly what Sylvanas was scared of, exactly the reason she burned down Teldrassil. The fact that the song continues, hope continues, life continues, I think was just a really powerful but very subtle note in the story, and it really struck me. But then you get that final moment where Anduin realises it's war, and again you get that beautiful image of Teldrassil burning, which I think is wonderful to have that at the heart of both stories, and that pivotal moment. But talking about the end of Elegy, and I guess talking about the overall climax of both stories, what struck you guys?
As you mentioned, Astari's spell, when she puts the elves to sleep. There's that one, the one mother and the kid. The Blizzard was masterful in coming back to the mother and the kid stuff, even in Warbringers and everything. Like that, just it's tough. It is, and you're just these poor elves that are just all they can do is just sleep through it, and that's probably like the best thing for them, because it's just vicious.
I think one of the things that they've done so masterfully at the very end of both Eulogy and A Good War is just, I mean, it's essentially just punching you in the gut. Like, I know I already said this to a degree, but it's, as a player character, we always see the broad spectrum of things. We're never really in it so far as, like, you know, we see the smoke coming out of the portals. We were watching people die a slow, painful death. You know, like, just civilians, people that we've known and interacted with for a very long time. And it's nice that they give us that perspective, because it's one of those things that, like, I don't always think of. I forget sometimes. I'm like, oh, of course Teldrassil's burning and people dying of smoke and fire, and I'm like, they make you realize how terrible it actually is. And it's not just like, oh, the tree's burning but everyone's fine. It's like, no, this is going to be the worst thing you've ever read, and you're going to hate yourself, and it's going to be painful, and we want to make everybody feel that pain. So I think they did an excellent job of that. It was very hard to read as any player. You're like, this is just, they walk you through the horrors of what's happening. And I think it was actually, I don't want to say it was refreshing, because most of the books we get are very, like, kind of broad, top down. We don't get a lot of in the moment sort of things like this. So anyway, good.
Well, what's interesting is both books end on, like, down notes. Nobody comes out of this happy. Because, I mean, obviously the Alliance suffered a massive loss, and even then, like, it's not even like Sylvanas, the one person who you would think, like, she ordered the burning, like, she should at least be, like, cackling maniacally and, like, gleeful that, like, this, like, no, even she knows, like, this was the wrong thing. Like, she did this, you know, somewhat reluctantly, like, there's gonna be repercussions for everybody, that nobody, like, nobody won this. This is just all terrible, and it's... I guess that's the thing about A Good War is it's a bit more of a, like, at least with, like, Elegy, it's like everything just kind of, like you said, it just jumps on you, and then it's all just downhill from there, because you didn't expect this to be coming, and it's just reacting, and then seeing what you lost at the end of it. With the Horde side, it's like, oh, hey, we've got this great plan, and everything's going well, and then it all just falls apart at the worst possible moment, and then it's all just shit. And
it's just bad.
It's just, like, nothing. Nobody can feel good coming out of this. Nobody. No.
No, and I think that's kind of why they place that image at the center of the book, because it's such a powerful image to look on in light of what's happened at the climax of both those books. And something that struck me is, and again, we're talking about the hard copy version here, but something I thought was very interesting was the orientation of it. It's a weird side note, but it's upright for the Alliance side, and and it's upside down for the Horde. And for me, what that, maybe I'm reading into it too much, I probably am, but something that says to me is that it spells for the Alliance that they completely understand what's happening. There's a certain resolution. They see the reality for what it is, that one of their major cities has been burned, whereas it's the Horde's perspective and the kind of their world that's been turned upside down by Sylvanas' actions. And I again, probably reading into it too much, but I think it's just a really it's, again, that's kind of the beauty of this hard copy version. I know we're trying to sell something at the moment, but it's, for me, there's so many interpretations because of this beautiful artwork. And again, we haven't even touched on some of the artwork that's spread out throughout the story. But yeah, no, really nice close. Really nice close. And obviously you've got that moment where Gen walks through the portal, the very last portal, and it all comes to a close. Speaking of which, we should probably come to a close ourselves. Although a slightly happier close. But we haven't talked about characters. We've kind of touched on various ones. We haven't really spoken about any in great detail. And I think we focus on the story, which is the right thing to do. But is there anything about any of the characters, sort of just wrapping up in the next 10 minutes, is there anything about any of the characters that struck either of you? We've talked about Sylvanas' motivations. We haven't spoke about Malfurion, Tyrande. I'm trying to think of some other Horde characters, but I think there's very few major Horde characters that play out in this particular story. But Katie, Nick, any character thoughts you have?
One thing I want to mention real quickly is just sort of a footnote is Cordressa Briarbro, I think her name is.
Yep.
She was in Before the Storm. And they reference it. She was involved with the gnome when she got kidnapped.
Yep.
Yep.
She's actually like Christy Golden's character.
Yeah.
And she actually, Golden's actually written her in. I think she also shows up in War Crimes, although I don't remember her
she does.
specifically. But yeah, so then she shows up here and she meets with Malfurion and everything. And again, I think she survives it all. But
what a surprise!
It's just exactly. It's we'll see her show up again, I guess, until she's ready to switch to her alt.
Is that what they call it? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I thought that was that's an interesting little footnote to know.
Mm-hmm.
That's really good.
I think, I know, I've already said this, but I love the fact that we heard the story narrative told through many different characters. It wasn't just, here are the main, like, here's Sourfang, Sylvanas, Malfurion. We were actually told the narrative through characters that we've never met before, for the most part. And then we become attached to, and then, of course, they kill them in the most brutal way possible, such as the Warcraft way, it seems. But I thought it was refreshing, and it was also heartbreaking, because even after reading Good War, you know that these characters that you are getting attached to in Eulogy, like, they're not going to make this out on the other side, most likely. Like, especially the Sentinel that you see. I'm trying to remember her name. Dallas, I think. But the one that I was gonna say the one that Sylvanas makes the tree bird. Like, she, in that cinematic, right? Because I knew who that was, and then I was reading Eulogy, and I'm like, oh, this is gonna hurt a lot, because I figured that she was a main character. Because when I was playing the actual in-game quest, I was like, oh, we get to know this Sentinel rather well, and this is gonna hurt a lot. And then I read Eulogy, I'm like, yep, this hurts a lot. This is feels bad man moment. But I really enjoyed that they were playing up and creating new characters. The Horde side, it wasn't just told from an orc's perspective. It was told from many different races, and I thought that was really neat. And then there was a lot of elves, and I was like, they're all going to die, and that was very sad. So
there aren't as many elves now.
I don't even want to think about it. I feel bad.
942 less, I believe. But you're totally right. I'm sure they'll come back. One of the things, though, that you're right. I think I'm really glad they told this story through characters who, largely speaking, didn't make it through the conflict, because I think one of the big problems of WoW is that the story is too often told through characters who Blizzard is reluctant to kill off. We will rarely get a variant situation, and well, I say that, I've realised we've actually had quite a few leaders killed off in recent expansions, but it's not the same. I think, if anything, there's a bit where Sylvanas and Malfurion are fighting just before Sourfang obviously intervenes, and to me, they're good bits. They're really good bits, but obviously you know the stakes, you know what's going to happen. So in a sense, the war kind of loses a bit of its grittiness and some of just the stakes involved. Whereas with Delarin, maybe depending on how far you've played into the game, you don't know which way she's going to go. Certainly for Larash. And for some of the other minor characters, you don't know whether they're going to make it through. Farron in particular, you just don't know how it's going to go. You just assume they're going to make it through somehow, because they're all, they're in love, and it's all happy-go-lucky sort of attitude. But So I think we'll bring things to a close there. Obviously, from my perspective, I think it's a great book. Whether you read the PDFs or have the hard copy version, really recommend the hard copy version if you can get a copy, because the artwork supporting it is absolutely gorgeous. But I can't recommend this enough. I think it's in some ways, I think it surpasses Before the Storm because of the impact it has. I can see myself revisiting this, whereas Before the Storm, I think, will, like many books, fall to the wayside of, there's other lore to read, or, I just really liked the whole mechanism of this book. And we talked about how it's, double-sided and how that all plays out. And the perspective, I keep mentioning that word, perspective, is just a really wonderful part of this book. And it's always got something new to teach us. And now I'm starting to make it bigger than what it is. But hey, I really like this book. I'm starting to make it sound like the Bible, but that's me. Guys, what did you think of, final thoughts? I know we started off thinking about, what we thought, but closing thoughts on and recommendations, if you will.
I guess I'll jump in here. I also loved it. It's like, no, I hated this book. It was terrible. That's why I'm talking about it with so passionately. No, I do think one of the coolest parts about the book was having the same narratives told side by side. Well, they're not the same narratives, but having the same story told side by side, but having different narratives throughout that really help you get a whole picture and to understand, like, they did an excellent job of really nailing home what you're supposed to feel, like the fear, the confusion, at first you feel good as a horde player, and then you feel really, really bad, and then at the end everyone feels terrible because no one has won. Like, it's almost a very disheartening and demoralizing book once you go through the whole thing, and then of course you're like, well, time to do the Alliance side because that's gonna be a cheery story. But I think it's one of the better narratives they've told in a book format because they've done such a good job of making you feel kind of hopeless and hapless at the end. You're like, I couldn't control this. There's nothing I could do to stop it. I can't prevent it. I can't actually interact with any of this. It's just all happened and it all snowballed out from under everyone. And it's like, where's the story going to go from here? Like, what's going to happen? And we've now been a part of a very big world event that was very tragic, and that's going to be an interesting thing going forward. So I absolutely love the book. It really explains a lot of motivations. And without the book, I think the story would be so much less. So I'm so glad they've done it. I think it's absolutely necessary to read if people are like, oh, hey, I'm kind of interested in the lore and the narrative. Give it a read. As obviously we all hated it, so without the recommendations, people please go pick it up or read the PDF or something, because it was good, and I will probably read it again once I'm done crying. So
Mick, over to you. Yeah.
So as far as like playing through the quests in the game, like all we do is we do quests. That's the entire game basically, and it's like you get used to just, you go here, you kill some of these things, you do this or whatever, get the standard bare asses, as it were. And so even like playing through like the quests for this, the War of the Thorns over those 2 weeks in the game, it still felt very, I'm just doing this. Sure, maybe there's some other players around me, maybe there's not. But it's hard to really grasp the scope of what's going on, that you just feel like it's just your character, you're doing this stuff. Sure, Sorfang shows up, Malfurion shows up, like you see the major name characters, but to compare like that quest line experience, being War of the Thorns as opposed to like some random quest in like Tanaris or something, you don't necessarily get the full scope, but this gives you that scope that you feel like, okay, I understand why this was War of the Thorns. Like, like when, even then, like reading Chronicle 3 and like where they're talking about some of the campaigns in, that happened in WoW. Like, I don't think they got to the Siege of Orgrimmar, but, some of the later campaigns in Vanilla and Northrend especially, Ice Crowned, like, it still doesn't necessarily feel like a major assault at all the times because you're just off doing your own thing. But this really, it gives you, it puts you in perspective. I know you mentioned perspectives before, that you get the Alliance and the Horde perspective. There's really 4 perspectives here because there's the 2 books and then also the 2 quest lines that you play through, whether you play Alliance and Horde. And to put that all together, it gives you such a massive picture of what happened in Ashenvale, in in Darkshore, in Teldrassil, that it allows you to contextualize everything in a way that you otherwise wouldn't. And I know it's cheap to kind of say like, oh, to really understand everything, you need to like read the stuff that's not in the game. But I think to give the full picture that they wanted to, I don't see how they could have put all this in the game. That there's a lot here that needed to be in a book, and maybe more could have been in the game. And you know, where that line is exactly, I don't know, but there's definitely stuff here that that couldn't be told in the game, and it really. I think the most confounding part of all this is, you know, like this leads into the battle for Lordaeron, and then Lordaeron leads into the Kulturas and Zandalar. Like that's really the like I want to get back to this stuff. Like everybody, I mean, I know we're like a month into Battle for Azeroth now, but like a month ago, everybody was so incensed over the burning of Teldrassil and like the coming faction war that, you know, we've kind of lost that, and it's going to be interesting to see. I think they're going to be announcing patch 8.1 soon. Like, I know we've had the Warfront campaigns to spur everybody along, but like, when are we going to get back to that? When is the Alliance going to be calling for Sylvanas' head, and when is the Horde going to be like, maybe we should give it to them? I don't know.
We've done something pretty bad.
Yeah, like I mean, because this is, I mean, that 2 weeks when this came out and we had all the cinematics and the Warbringers and the War for the Thorns, that I think was like the two of the best weeks in WoW. And I know as much of the player base was enraged over that.
It was interesting though.
It was interesting, and it's to Blizzard's credit that they took everybody on this ride and they went for it. And let's get back to that. I mean, this book is a huge part of that, and I mean, I don't want to like kind of bury the book in the bigger story, but the book is part of the bigger story. But at the same time, like, it's definitely worth it. If you haven't, if you listen to this and you hadn't checked it out, why? I mean, we ruined so much of it, but I think you're right though, that this is more relevant than Before the Storm. And not to say that Before the Storm tried to serve a different purpose, but I mean, if I was going to tell anybody, like, read one thing before getting into the Battle for Azeroth stuff, I would say this, hands down. I mean, Before the Storm is good in its own way, not to diminish that, but this is definitely, if you want to feel, if you really want to feel, and I mean, Before the Storm will make you feel too, but this. Oh, you're going to feel like Delaran with all the arrows sticking in your back by the end of this. This is brutal.
We're surfing.
Well, there's no chapter telling Galakron's version of events, is there? There's none of that. And, you know, maybe we would have felt differently if that had been the case. But no, I think that's a perfect way to wrap it up, because you're right. I'm encouraged that if you look at some of the Lordaeron, or both the Lordaeron cinematics, that they have unique perspectives in them. And I really do hope we continue this sort of divergent way of telling a story, and I hope it continues. I guess it's kind of unique to the factions, and because you can't really, well, maybe I was going to say you can't really do it with extra faction characters sort of things, but we've had already a Shara's perspective on certain things, so who knows. I'd love to see perhaps more of this going on. You bring up an interesting point though, Nick, because at the end of Elegy, it makes a big point that Gen was clutching Mia, who was clutching Finel, and they went through the last portal, and that's a complete lie, because that git went in before me and left me behind. So I was actually the last one through the portal, but I guess that wouldn't make a good story, would it? You know, and Tyrande sung the lullaby while the oddly dressed paladin clutching the fish artifact scrambled his way.
If you're a paladin, you could have bubble hearthed. So.
I could have bubble hearthed, but I wanted to use the portal. Plus, I was roaming around outside and couldn't really figure out what was going on. But hey ho. But what a really good point to end on. So, yeah, universal praise. Bring us more Blizz, bring us more Christy Gold and Rob Brooks, and heck, all the people who supported it. It's just a great group of people, really great content. Long may it continue, although, you know, who knows, we may look back on a year from now and think, God almighty, did we get this one wrong? So, who knows. But we'll end it there, because that's almost 2 hours worth of content, and I think that's more than enough to cover this book. So, well, it's not, but I'm going to say it is. So yeah, anyways, thank you very much everyone for listening. We'll be back, well, next time with The War of the Ancients, part 1. You know, we ended this one with a lot of Dead Night Elves. We're going to continue with probably a few Dead Night Elves, but the Night Elf story's pretty good.
They don't lose their home there, do they?
Yeah, I think they lose Azeroth, don't they?
There's a lot of things that were lost. Yeah, actually.
Yeah, the Sundering, that little event. But so hopefully you'll join us for that.
Footnote.
It's a little footnote, yeah, not a major event. But hopefully you'll join us for that. It'll be War of the Ancients Part 1. You can pick it up, all good retailers and wherever else you can find it underneath a rock. But until then, Nick, Katie, thank you very much for joining us. Nick, starting with you, where can people find you and both your podcasts if they want to?
I am at WookieBH on Twitter, and you can find the Torn and the Goblin at Torn Goblin on Twitter.
Perfect. Casey?
You can find me on Twitter as well at HyruleMasters77 and on the Torn and the Goblin.
Fantastic. And, you can find me on the Geeks of Azeroth podcast, or sort of bumbling about on EU realms trying to figure out how I turn off war mode, if that's a thing. Still can't bring myself to go back to Stormwind. It just takes too much time up. But hey-ho. But yes, anyways, ending on there. Thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you in the next episode.